Welcome to the Haven Collective. I'm J.R. Foresteros, and this is the Beacon Bit. Today we're talking about Revelation 21, verses 1 through 6. When you think about theater, you may think about those two masks that always show up that sort of represent the theater. One is a comedy mask, and one is a tragedy mask. One is smiling, one is frowning. Now, in a way, those go all the way back to the ancient Greeks who had to wear masks so people could see them from far off because they didn't, they had just invented theater, so they didn't really build their theaters to be optimal for seeing expressions and stuff like that. But really, they go back to this idea coined by Lord Byron, who said, "All tragedies are finished by death. All comedies are ended by a marriage. The future states of both are left to faith." That was his way of saying that if a story ends with any kind of a funeral, whether it's literal or metaphorical, it's a tragedy. And if it ends with a wedding, again, whether that's metaphorical or literal, it's a comedy. So that's why, for instance, romantic films usually end with a kiss or "and they lived happily ever after," right? It's a coming together, it's a wedding, it's two becoming one. And so romances are traditionally considered comedies, not because they're funny, but because they end on an up note. Whereas you take things like, I don't know, horror movies or tragedy movies. Like I think about the movie The Breakup that starred Vince Vaughn and Jennifer Aniston. A lot of people were angry because that film played like a romantic comedy, but it was called The Breakup, and spoilers for that movie, it ended with them breaking up. So it ended with a funeral, a death, a separation of this relationship, not of any particular character, right? But it still counts as Byron's funeral. It's a final separation. So that movie is a tragedy, right? That's again not necessarily because it ends with death literally, but metaphorically. That's the important point. So that's why I think it's so fascinating that the book of Revelation closes the Christian canon, because it has the final say on what kind of story the Christian faith is. Is this finally a comedy or a tragedy? And to hear a lot of Christians talk about the life of faith, you might think it's a tragedy, because a lot of us were taught that at the end of all things, when we experience our own funerals, and then when everything is concluded, the earth is destroyed, and the good people get to go to heaven and be with God. So there's a little bit of hope in that the faithful are united with God in this sort of divine wedding, right? But if you zoom out a little bit, you see that ultimately the universe ends as a tragedy. Creation was this failed experiment where God ended up having to destroy everything. There's a ton of death and destruction, and then there's just like a little bit of hope just for a few people. I would argue that that's more of a tragedy. I think about something like the film Titanic, right? Which is about this massive, massive tragedy. And yes, a few people are saved in James Cameron's film. We get to spend a little bit of time with the survivor Rose, but most people, including poor Jack, right, ended up dying. So even though a few people get a happy ending, it doesn't leave you feeling this overwhelming sense of positivity and joy the way a true comedy does. Fortunately, that's not what we have in Revelation 21, verses 1 through 6. It's actually very much the opposite of that. What we get is actually a divine wedding. And if you go back in chapter 20, the wedding feast of the Lamb was announced by angels in heaven. And we don't even have time to get into all that. It's one of those really cool parts of the book we had to skip over. But immediately after the wedding feast of the Lamb is announced, John tells us that he sees the holy city Jerusalem, which is, God's heavenly throne, descending out of heaven as though dressed like a bride. And then what we see is a wedding. Heaven and earth become one. The separation that existed all the way back since the garden when humanity and God were exiled from each other is finally reconciled. And all of creation is redeemed and restored to its best version. And God and humanity live together in peace. And we have this amazing picture of what that looks like. Now, we're going to get into a lot of the details of that next week. But I want to focus this week on what it says about God and about us and about our world, that when the Bible has a chance to offer a final vision of what kind of story is being told, the Bible chooses comedy. It chooses hope. It chooses joy, not just for a blessed few, but for as many as possible and ultimately for the entire world. I think that's a really provocative difference, again, from I think the dominant narrative that's in most of popular Christianity. Certainly, it's what I think most non Christians think. And again, if you're anything like me, it's probably like what a lot of us were taught growing up. So I want to challenge this idea that in the end we just zip away to somewhere else because that's not what Scripture says. That's not the vision that Scripture has. I'm really looking forward to this conversation in our Beacon Bits this week. Until then, grace and peace be with you.